All right, let's break it down. The germ that doctors refused to wash away. In 1847, a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis was working in the maternity wards of Vienna General Hospital when he noticed something that should have been obvious. Women delivering babies in the ward, staffed by doctors, were dying at rates between 10 and 35%. Women in the ward, staffed by midwives, were dying at under 4%. The wards were in the same building. The difference was that the doctors came directly from the autopsy room. At the time, the dominant theory of disease was miasma, the idea that illness floated through bad air. The concept of invisible particles carried on unwashed hands was not just unproven, it was considered beneath serious scientific consideration. Physicians were gentlemen. Gentlemen's hands did not carry death. That was the operating assumption of European medicine in the 1840s, and challenging it was not a scientific disagreement. It was a social insult. Semmelweis introduced chlorinated lime hand washing in his ward, and mortality dropped to under 2% almost immediately. He published his findings. He presented his data. He named the mechanism: cadaverous particles transferred from corpse to patient, which was germ theory before germ theory had a name. The Vienna Medical Society rejected him. Prominent physicians, including the influential Charles Meigs of Philadelphia, dismissed him publicly. He was removed from his hospital position in 1849, and eventually, in 1865, he was committed to an asylum. He died there within 2 weeks, almost certainly from an infection, the same category of death he had spent his career trying to prevent. Louis Pasteur confirmed germ theory in the 1860s. Joseph Lister published Antiseptic Surgical Methods in 1867. Between Semmelweis's death and Lister's publication, the medical establishment had a 2-year window during which they knew the mechanism, had the data, and chose institutional pride over patient lives. That 2-year gap has no name. It should. The automatic rejection of evidence that implicates the establishment in harm is now called the Semmelweis reflex. It is recognized in medical literature as a documented psychological phenomenon, which raises one question worth sitting with. If it happened once, and we named it, and we still kept doing it, what does that tell us about every treatment that came after? The machine that made cancer cells explode. Sometime in the early 1930s, in a laboratory in San Diego, a self-taught engineer named Royal Raymond Rife was doing something that mainstream optics said was impossible. He was building a microscope that could see living viruses, not dead, stained specimens on a slide, living, moving microorganisms observed in real time, in full color. The scientific consensus at the time held that optical microscopes could not achieve the magnification required. Rife built one anyway, and claimed it reached 60,000 times magnification. The significance of seeing living pathogens, if the claim was accurate, cannot be overstated. Every microscopy technique available in the 1930s required killing the specimen first. Rife's universal microscope, if it worked as described, would have been the most important optical instrument in the history of medicine. It would have allowed researchers to watch disease organisms behave in real biological conditions, in living tissue, in real time. The entire field of virology would have been transformed within a decade. Rife went further. He identified what he called a cancer microbe, designated the BX virus, and then built a second device, the beam ray, which he claimed could destroy pathogens using their specific electromagnetic resonant frequency, the mortal oscillatory rate, without damaging surrounding healthy tissue. In 1934, a clinical study conducted at Scripps Ranch in California claimed that 16 of 16 terminal cancer patients treated with the beam ray recovered within 70 days. The research was never published in a peer-reviewed journal. Within 5 years, Rife's laboratory had been broken into. His equipment had been seized, and his primary scientific collaborator, Dr. Milbank Johnson, died suddenly before he could testify publicly. Every original Rife microscope has since disappeared. The modern heir to Rife's core principle is not fringe medicine. Tumor Treating Fields, or TT Fields, received FDA approval in 2011 for glioblastoma. Low-intensity pulsed ultrasound is used in bone healing and is being investigated in oncology. Both operate on the foundational hypothesis Rife described in the 1930s, that specific frequencies can disrupt cancer cell behavior without the systemic toxicity of chemotherapy. The science survived. Rife did not. Whether he was a visionary working beyond his era's ability to verify him, or a gifted fraud whose claims could not withstand scrutiny, the answer to that question was never properly sought. The records that would have answered it are gone. The nurse who found the cancer cure in a teacup. In 1922, a Canadian nurse named Renee Case was working in a hospital in Ontario when an elderly patient showed her a pattern of scars on her chest, the remnants of a healed breast tumor. The woman said an Ojibwe medicine man had given her an herbal tea decades earlier. She had written the recipe down. She handed it to Case. Case kept it for 7 years before she used it. Then a family member was diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer, and she brewed the tea. The formula contained 4 plants: burdock root, sheep sorrel, slippery elm bark, and Turkish rhubarb root. Case named it Esiac, her own surname spelled backward, and for the next 5 decades, she administered it to cancer patients out of a clinic in Bracebridge, Ontario. She charged nothing. She refused to profit from the formula. She turned down financial offers repeatedly, on the stated grounds that if she accepted money and the treatment failed anyone, she would never forgive herself. That level of conviction is either the mark of a true believer or a genuine healer. In her case, distinguishing between the two became a political problem. By 1938, the story had grown large enough to reach Parliament. A petition signed by 55,000 Canadians called for Esiac to be legalized. The bill came to a vote and fell short by 3 votes. Among the physicians who had personally observed Case's patients was Dr. Frederick Banting, the co-discoverer of insulin and one of the most credible medical figures in Canadian history. Banting did not endorse the formula. He called for formal investigation. That investigation was never conducted during his lifetime. In 1977, Case finally handed the formula to the Respirene Corporation, which conducted the clinical trials that were supposed to settle the question. Researchers who reviewed the trial design before publication argued that the protocol was inadequate, that dosages were inconsistent, and that the conditions bore no resemblance to how Case had actually administered the treatment. The results were negative. The question was declared closed. Sheep sorrel, one of the 4 components of Esiac, contains alloimodin, a compound that has demonstrated selective cytotoxicity in cancer cell lines in peer-reviewed studies published since the 1990s. Not in patients. In the laboratory. The compound works on isolated cells. What happens when it is combined with the other 3 plants, in the proportions Case used, administered the way she administered it, has never been tested in a properly designed trial. She charged nothing, had physician witnesses, and came within 3 votes of legal recognition. The question of what exactly was being protected is still open. The doctor who cured cancer with electricity and lost everything. Before the 1910s, Albert Abrams was not a fringe figure. He was called the Dean of American Medicine, a former president of the San Francisco Medical Society, a respected clinician and lecturer whose textbooks were used in medical schools across the country. Then he turned his attention to electrical oscillations, and the medical establishment turned its attention to destroying him. Abrams developed a diagnostic and treatment system he called the electronic reactions of Abrams, built around devices including the oscilloclast, which he claimed could both identify disease and treat it using specific electrical frequencies tuned to the resonant signature of pathogens. The theory held that every biological state, healthy or diseased, produces a characteristic electromagnetic oscillation, and that introducing a counter-frequency could neutralize the pathological one. By the early 1920s, an estimated 3,500 practitioners across the United States were using his devices. The American Medical Association commissioned an investigation, published in Scientific American in 1924, which declared the devices fraudulent. The investigation tested the machines under experimental conditions that Abrams had not specified as the correct operating parameters. Critics of the investigation noted this at the time. The objections were not addressed. Abrams died in 1924 during the investigation, and the AMA's verdict became permanent by default. His name entered the medical literature as a synonym for quackery, and the idea that electrical fields could interact therapeutically with cancer cells was contaminated by association for decades. In 2011, the FDA approved tumor-treating fields for the treatment of glioblastoma, an aggressive brain cancer with a median survival of 15 months. The device, marketed as Optune by Novocure, delivers low-intensity alternating electrical fields directly to the tumor site. A 2015 study published in the New England Journal of Medicine confirmed that TT fields extended median survival by 4.9 months in combination with chemotherapy. The mechanism: alternating electrical fields disrupt the alignment of proteins during cancer cell division, selectively killing dividing cells. That mechanism is not what Abrams proposed. But the foundational premise that cancer cells interact with electrical fields in ways that can be therapeutically exploited is now FDA-approved medicine. When Novocure published its data, no major medical publication connected it to Abrams. The idea had been made so toxic by association with fraud that even its vindication passed without acknowledgement. They did not just ban the machine. They poisoned the idea so thoroughly that even when the idea turned out to be right, no one wanted to say so out loud. The vitamin they said would kill you. Linus Pauling is the only person in history to win 2 unshared Nobel Prizes. Chemistry in 1954, for his work on the nature of the chemical bond. Peace in 1962, for his anti-nuclear activism. He was, by any measure, among the most credible scientific minds of the 20th century. In the last decades of his life, he became convinced that high-dose vitamin C could dramatically extend the survival of terminal cancer patients. The medical establishment spent 20 years trying to prove him wrong, and the way they did it may be the most consequential methodological sleight of hand in the history of oncology. In 1976, Pauling and Scottish surgeon Ewan Cameron published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showing that terminal cancer patients receiving 10 grams of vitamin C daily intravenously survived 4.2 times longer than matched controls. The response from mainstream oncology was swift. The Mayo Clinic conducted 2 trials, published in 1979 and 1985, that found no significant anti-tumor effect. The trials were widely cited as definitive. Pauling was publicly marginalized. He died in 1994, still advocating for vitamin C research, still being dismissed. The problem is the delivery method. Pauling and Cameron administered vitamin C intravenously. The Mayo Clinic administered it orally. This is not a minor procedural difference. Oral vitamin C is subject to intestinal absorption limits and renal clearance. Intravenous vitamin C bypasses both. The plasma concentrations achieved by intravenous administration are approximately 70 times higher than those achievable orally. The Mayo Clinic trials did not test what Pauling had claimed. They tested a different intervention and declared Pauling's intervention disproven. In 2005, researchers at the National Institutes of Health published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, confirming that at pharmacological concentrations, achievable only intravenously, vitamin C acts as a pro-oxidant in tumor tissue, generating hydrogen peroxide that selectively kills cancer cells. Healthy cells are protected by their catalase activity. Cancer cells are not. The NIH paper validated Pauling's mechanism 11 years after his death. As of 2024, over 30 clinical trials are investigating intravenous vitamin C in combination with standard chemotherapy, with Phase 2 results showing improved quality of life and, in some cancers, improved response rates. When the NIH confirms your mechanism, and the trials that destroyed your reputation used the wrong delivery method, and you won 2 Nobel Prizes before any of this happened, the word for what occurred to Linus Pauling has not yet been agreed upon. But it is not science. The doctor Mexico couldn't silence. In 1967, a Polish-born physician named Stanislaw Burzynski was working as a researcher at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas, when he identified a group of peptides occurring naturally in human blood and urine that appeared in significantly lower concentrations in cancer patients than in healthy individuals. He called them anti-neoplastons. His hypothesis was that they functioned as a biochemical defense system, capable of reprogramming cancer cells back toward normal differentiation without the toxicity of chemotherapy. He spent the next 5 decades trying to prove it, and the FDA spent nearly as long trying to stop him. Anti-neoplastons do not fit neatly into the pharmacological model that dominates cancer research. They are not synthetic compounds developed in a corporate laboratory. They are naturally occurring peptides, which means they cannot be patented in their original form, which means there is no revenue stream to justify the billion-dollar clinical trials that produce FDA approval. Burzynski recognized this early and developed his own synthesis process, filing patents on his specific formulations. In the 1980s, the pharmaceutical company Elan filed patents on anti-neoplastin-related compounds. The financial stakes of who held the controlling intellectual property on an effective cancer treatment were considerable. Burzynski opened a clinic in Houston and began treating patients. He sought and received FDA authorization to conduct clinical trials, eventually running over 60 of them. In 1995, federal prosecutors convened a grand jury and brought charges against him. The case proceeded for 2 years. The grand jury deadlocked. He was never convicted. His patients, many of them referred to his clinic after conventional oncology had exhausted its options, testified publicly. Among them were children diagnosed with diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, a pediatric brain cancer with a median survival of 9 to 15 months, for which conventional medicine has no effective treatment as of 2025. The Texas Medical Board has attempted to revoke his license multiple times. He has retained it each time. His clinic in Houston is still open. 60 years after he identified anti-neoplastons at Baylor, no major institution has conducted a properly funded Phase 3 trial of his primary treatment. The FDA authorized the trials, then prosecuted the physician conducting them. 47 years of federal prosecution, license challenges, and international controversy, and he is still treating patients, and the FDA still has no answer for the cancer that keeps sending children to his door. The apricot seed that launched a global war. In 1952, a biochemist named Ernst T. Krebs Jr. extracted a compound from apricot seeds and declared it a missing nutrient he designated vitamin B17. He called it letrol, a purified form of amygdalin, a naturally occurring compound found in the seeds of apricots, bitter almonds, apples, and dozens of other plants. His proposed mechanism: cancer cells contain an enzyme called beta-glucosidase that unlocks cyanide from amygdalin, selectively poisoning the tumor from within, while healthy cells, protected by a neutralizing enzyme called rhodonase, remain unharmed. Within a decade, letrol was the most controversial substance in the history of the FDA. The agency banned it in 1963. Over the following 15 years, 27 American states passed laws explicitly permitting its use within their borders, in direct defiance of federal prohibition. The scale of public demand was unlike anything the FDA had faced before or since. In 1979, a case called United States versus Rutherford reached the Supreme Court, brought by terminal cancer patients arguing that the constitutional right to privacy extended to their choice of treatment. The court ruled against them, holding that the FDA's authority over unapproved drugs extended even to the dying. The clinics in Tijuana opened within months of the federal ban and never closed. Estimates from the 1970s through the 1990s suggest that approximately 70,000 Americans crossed the border specifically to receive laetrile treatment at Mexican clinics. The National Cancer Institute conducted a clinical trial in 1982, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, that found no significant anti-tumor response. Critics of the trial noted that dosing was inconsistent across patients, that no protocol standardization was enforced, and that the trial was designed without input from practitioners who had been using the compound for decades. Amygdalin compounds have demonstrated selective cytotoxicity in cancer cell lines in multiple peer-reviewed studies since 2005, including a 2014 study published in the Journal of Experimental and Clinical Cancer Research. These are laboratory findings, not clinical results. The gap between the two has never been properly bridged. When 27 states vote to legalize something, 70,000 people cross an international border to access it, and the Supreme Court rules that dying patients cannot choose their own treatment. The question of who exactly is being protected deserves a more precise answer than the one on record. The scientist who cured cancer then disappeared. In the spring of 1990, a courtroom in Quebec heard testimony from 85 witnesses. Each of them said the same thing. They had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. They had been told there was nothing more medicine could do for them. They had gone to a French biologist named Gaston Naessens, who had given them an injection of a compound called 714X, and they were alive. The government of Canada was trying to put Naessens in prison. The jury acquitted him. Naessens had been building unconventional microscopes since the 1940s. He called his primary instrument the somatoscope and claimed it achieved 30,000 times magnification using visible light, comparable to claims made by Royal Rife 2 decades earlier, and similarly impossible to reconcile with established optical physics. Through this instrument, he claimed to have identified tiny subcellular particles he called somatids, which he believed cycled through 16 distinct forms in healthy and diseased states. In cancer patients, he argued, the somatid cycle became destabilized, and the body's immune system was progressively depleted. 714X, a camphor nitrogen compound, was injected directly into the lymphatic system at the inguinal lymph node, with the stated aim of restoring nitrogen balance and reactivating immune function. He had been expelled from France before Quebec. He had been acquitted of charges there, too. The pattern, prosecution, acquittal, exile, rebuilding, continued across his entire career. His laboratory was seized by Canadian authorities twice. He rebuilt it twice. Health Canada never approved 714X. It has been available through Canada's Special Access Program on compassionate grounds, meaning physicians can request it for patients with no remaining conventional options. That access point is an acknowledgement, however quiet, that the compound exists in a category the system cannot fully ignore. The somatoscope has never been independently validated. The somatid cycle has never been confirmed by any external laboratory. The microscopy claims conflict with established optical physics in ways that have not been satisfactorily resolved. But 85 patients stood up in a courtroom and said this man saved their lives. The government said the treatment did not work. The jury said he was innocent. And to this day, no institution has run the controlled trial that would settle the question permanently. The absence of that trial is not a scientific answer. It is a choice. The man who beat the patent system and paid for it with his life. In the summer of 1978, a German physician named Reich Gerd Hamer received the phone call that would define the rest of his life. His son Dirk had been shot by Prince Victor Emmanuel of Savoy while sleeping on a boat off the coast of Corsica. Dirk died 4 months later. Within the year, Hamer was diagnosed with testicular cancer. He had no prior history of illness. He was 50 years old. The proximity of the trauma and the diagnosis became the foundation of everything he would build and everything he would lose. Hamer developed what he called German New Medicine, a systematic framework proposing that every cancer originates from a specific, identifiable psychological shock, a biological conflict that triggers a precise response in a corresponding region of the brain, visible as a concentric ring pattern on a CT scan. He called these rings Hamer-Foci. He claimed that by identifying the originating conflict and resolving it, the body would naturally reverse the cancer process. He further argued that conventional treatments, by suppressing the biological program, made outcomes worse. This was not a quiet claim. It was a direct assault on the theoretical foundation of modern oncology. The response was correspondingly severe. Austrian medical authorities gave him a deadline to recant or lose his license. He refused. He was stripped of his license. He was convicted in France in 2004 on charges of fraud and practicing medicine without a license and served time in prison. Regulatory bodies across Germany, Austria, and France issued formal warnings against his methods. At least 10 documented deaths in Europe and Australia are attributed to patients who refused conventional treatment based on GNM guidance. Those deaths are real. They are on record. What is also on record is the field of psychoneuroimmunology, which studies the relationship between psychological stress, immune function, and disease progression. It is peer-reviewed. It is mainstream. It confirms that acute psychological trauma suppresses immune response, elevates cortisol, and accelerates tumor growth in measurable, documented ways. Hamer did not invent the connection between psychological shock and cancer onset. He tried to systematize it, map it, and use it clinically. That systematization is what sent him to prison. If stress demonstrably suppresses immune function and accelerates tumor growth, which is not fringe medicine, but established science, then the distance between what Hamer claimed and what oncology now accepts may be smaller than the sentence he served suggests. The treatment that was winning until it wasn't. In 1931, a German biochemist named Otto Warburg accepted the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for discovering that cancer cells generate energy differently from healthy cells. Healthy cells use oxygen to produce energy through a process called cellular respiration. Cancer cells, even in the presence of abundant oxygen, prefer to ferment glucose. This became known as the Warburg effect. He accepted the prize. He stated his conclusion. And then the medical establishment spent 70 years pretending he had not said it. In a lecture delivered at the annual meeting of Nobel laureates in Lindau, Germany, in 1966, Warburg was explicit. Cancer, above all other diseases, has countless secondary causes, but there is only one prime cause: the replacement of the respiration of oxygen in normal body cells by a fermentation of sugar. He was not hedging. He was not speculating. He was the Nobel laureate who had discovered the mechanism, and he was saying in plain language that cancer needs sugar to survive. His conclusion implied a therapeutic intervention so simple it required no patent, no pharmaceutical synthesis, and no billion-dollar development program. Stop feeding it. The metabolic theory of cancer was progressively sidelined through the 1960s and 70s as the somatic mutation theory gained dominance, the framework that cancer is fundamentally a genetic disease caused by accumulated DNA mutations. The war on cancer, launched by the Nixon administration in 1971 and funded through the National Cancer Institute, directed its resources almost entirely toward genetic and pharmacological approaches. Researcher Pete Pedersen at Johns Hopkins began proposing ketogenic dietary intervention against cancer in the 1990s. The idea was not funded at scale. There was no mechanism to fund it. You cannot patent the decision to restrict carbohydrates. A 2023 study, published in Cell Metabolism by researcher Lou Cantley at Cornell, confirmed that insulin spikes triggered by dietary sugar directly fuel tumor growth, validating Warburg's core hypothesis at the molecular level, nearly a century after he first described it. As of 2024, over 80 clinical trials registered at clinicaltrials.gov are investigating ketogenic or glucose-restrictive diets in cancer treatment. Warburg was reportedly nominated for a second Nobel Prize, but Hitler's government had banned Germans from accepting the award after the 1937 decree prohibiting it. and the nomination was never fulfilled. A man won the Nobel Prize, stated the cure in a public lecture, and watched the conclusion be set aside for 7 decades. Not because he was wrong, because you cannot patent the decision to stop eating sugar, and in the funding architecture of modern oncology, that made his discovery worth approximately nothing to the people who decide what gets researched next. Look at what connects these 10 cases. In every one of them, the mechanism of suppression followed the same architecture. A discovery appeared that could not be monetized in the conventional pharmaceutical model. An institution, a medical society, a regulatory body, or a funding structure applied pressure. The records thinned. The trials were designed inadequately, conducted under the wrong conditions, or never conducted at all. The practitioner was discredited, prosecuted, or driven into exile. And then, years or decades later, the underlying principle quietly appeared in a peer-reviewed journal under a different name, attached to a different inventor, with a patent attached. Semmelweis's invisible particles became germ theory. Rife's frequencies became TT fields. Abrams's electrical fields became Novocure. Pauling's intravenous vitamin C became a 30-trial NIH research program. Warburg's sugar hypothesis became cell metabolism's cover story in 2023. The ideas survived. The people did not. And the question that sits at the center of all 10 of these stories is not whether the treatments worked. It is who decided which treatments deserve the chance to prove it. Subscribe if you think that question matters, and leave a comment with the one case from this list that you believe deserved a fair trial and never got one. Every cure that exists today was once called impossible by someone with a financial interest in the treatment it would replace. That is not a conspiracy. That is economics. And economics does not care who is right.